Hi, it's Beth from Manx Radio's newsroom and welcome to another edition of the newscast. Today, talking to Lawrie Hooper MHK about the Bishop. He's launched a public consultation this morning. Let's find out more.
So a little while back, early last year, there was a debate in Tynwald about the Bishop's position, whether or not he should be retained or whether his vote should be retained. Ultimately, the House of Keys voted by a majority that the Bishop really shouldn't have a vote. That's where the Tynwald debate ended. Off the back of that, I thought, well, if this is the will of the House of Keys, it's worth introducing a bill. That's what I did. I had leave to introduce a bill, started going through that process, and actually then at the last sitting of last year, the House of Keys decided that they wanted me to consult with the public on the bill. The bill has a single purpose, which is to simply remove the Bishop's vote, but keep his seat in Ledgeco and in Tynwald. That's it. The consultation is going live. It's available online on my website. Paper copies are available for a small printing charge from the Clerk of Tynwald's office. It is a relatively straightforward consultation, only 4 questions. The bill only does one thing, so really it is a yes-no kind of proposition.
And how long will that consultation run for?
So the intention is the consultation will run until the end of February, so to give it a full 8 weeks to make sure there's lots of opportunity for people to engage with the consultation. Like I say, it's quite a simple issue. I have shared a press release which talks a little bit about the background to it, but ultimately it's my belief that if you are going to represent people in Tynwald, really you should be elected by those people. That's true of everyone, I think, that sits in Tynwald. We should all be representatives of our public, and unfortunately the Bishop is not elected, he is appointed, and to my mind that means it isn't really a democratic part of our parliament, and really it's time to modernise.
So I suppose it could be argued, and it has certainly been argued before, that by that argument members of the Legislative Council haven't been elected by the public, so why didn't you target them?
I'd agree. Actually, my view is quite clear. I would prefer members of Ledgeco to be publicly elected as well. I think that's the natural evolution, really, of a democratic parliament. The reason that this bill has been so narrowly drawn to focus on the Bishop is because that's what the House of Keys voted on in Tynwald, so it really is a continuation of that vote. I didn't want to start unpicking a much bigger, much more complicated issue. Members of Ledgeco are indirectly elected by the Keys, so at least there is a form of democratic accountability. It's not as direct as I would like, and like I said in the debate when someone raised this exact question, if the House wants me to tackle Legislative Council members next, I'm happy to pick that one up, but for me, I think the reason for doing this is because it was very narrow, something very specific that the House had already supported. We're in a very small kind of downtime in terms of legislation as well, so there was capacity to do this, and because the bill was so narrow, it really is something I could achieve. I think if I'd started down the route of much more fundamental constitutional reform, like reforming the entirety of Legislative Council, I would have found that very difficult to do whilst being Minister for Health, because there's not enough time in the day, basically. Whereas this is something that I think is very specific, very narrowly drawn, and actually achieves a very clear and defined outcome.
You mentioned, obviously, this is a private member's bill, so you are in your capacity as constituency MHK. Have you spoken to your constituents? Do you know what their view is? So
it's an interesting one, because during the 2016 election campaign, the Lisvane report was up for debate, and it came up a lot on the doorstep in 2016 around that. So my views on Lisvane, and he talked about the Bishop and his role, are quite clearly on the record. You know, they're on my website. I've expressed them multiple times during the numbers of debates we've had on Lisvane and reform. And at that time, I think the view of people was quite clear. Obviously, my views haven't changed. In the last House, I voted a number of times to try and achieve the same end. Again, very publicly, I'm on the record with this. And members of Ramsey decided to re-elect me again this time around. So it should be no surprise, really, to anybody that this is my view. This is my long-held view. It's a long-held position of the Liberal Vannin Party that I lead, that our politicians should be democratically accountable to the people. Ultimately, it's the people of the island that should be sovereign and should have ultimate control over who represents them, who makes laws on their behalf. So this shouldn't be a huge surprise. And even so, even following the debate and following the consultation launch, I haven't really had a lot of feedback from people one way or the other than people who are reconfirming previously expressed views, if that makes sense. Because quite rightly, I don't think this is number one on people's agenda. It's there, but it's not in the top 10, which is why it's something that I think I'm doing whilst I have the capacity to do it, as opposed to this being the big thing I want to achieve this year. It's one of a number of things, but it surely isn't the most important one.
And I think that's key, because this is something that Manx Radio asked on social media about, and we got a healthy response to it. But there were people who said this is a distraction tactic. There are far more important things to worry about. Loads of other things going on. Boat issues, which seems quite timely as we're speaking. And some people did feel that having a moral, objective voice gives a more holistic view, perhaps, And so I guess the question, Mr. Hooper, has to be, why now, when there clearly are so many other things that need dealing with?
So I think the life of an MHK is quite complicated. And if you're an MHK that can't do more than one thing at a time, you're in the wrong job. So in my capacity as a backbencher, I was serving in 3 departments. I was on multiple committees, as well as tabling questions, amending bills and legislation, driving policy. It's a big job. Now, I think as a minister, it's exactly the same. There's 101 things that I deal with in any given day. This is another one of those things. And like I said, the reason I'm doing this, and it's been so narrowly drawn, is so as not to detract from all the other stuff that's going on. I think if I had come out of the gatepost and said, let's reform the whole of Tynwald, that would have been insane for me to do as a private member. That would have been far too much, and I don't think that would have been realistic. I couldn't have defended that to people going out saying I'm going to do something so big whilst also trying to hold a big portfolio, whereas this is a lot smaller.
I suppose there might be people saying, well, actually, if you want to reform it, actually do something meaningful, because what difference is taking away the bishop's vote actually going to make?
I think, again, that's a fair comment, but the nature of our political system means you never get radical reform. We don't have a party structure on the island. You have 33 independents, supposedly, who sit in the chamber and debate, which means every decision is a compromise, which means everything you do is incremental, small, slow change. And sometimes that's great. So when you're talking about a stable political environment, great, big tick in that box. But then when you do think actually big change is needed, it's very hard to drive that through. And so inevitably what you end up with is small, incremental change. And this process of constitutional reform has been going on for 150 years. It's not going to be resolved overnight. It's going to still be going on for the next 150 years. This is just another small step in what is a very big journey.
And it's a journey that you feel is the right one to take, but not everyone's going to agree with that.
No, that's true. And most of my colleagues in the House of Keys agreed with me that this is the right thing to do. Not everybody. There was a strong and determined opposition bench, I think, on this one. And it'll be the same out there in the public. Your own poll showed that quite clearly. It was 70-30 in favour, I think. So I expect the consultation response to be roughly along those lines. Most people, I think, generally agree that in a modern democracy, the people that make our laws, the people that make our policy, should be elected by us and accountable to us. Most people, I think, agree with that. There's some people, obviously, that think, no, there is a value in having an appointed role that doesn't have that responsibility to the electorate, and that's fair enough. We can agree to disagree on that. My position is quite clear. If we are going to be a modern 21st century democracy, the reality is our politicians, all of us, need to be accountable to the Manx public.
But Tynwald, by its very nature, is very much about tradition, isn't it? It's about its history. That's the thing we pride ourselves on. So there will be, again, some people saying, well, you're almost meddling with that.
I suppose to some extent that's true, that Tynwald does have a lot of tradition associated with it, but the biggest tradition in Tynwald actually is that of change. So we used to have Deemsters sitting here, we used to have the Dean, we used to have a lot more, the Vicar General sitting in Tynwald. There used to be a completely different makeup. It was only 150 years ago we started electing a House of Keys, and our House of Keys members used to elect themselves. So arguably, if you really want to stick with the traditional form of Tynwald, you should let me pick my successor rather than going for an election. I think that would be nuts. But some people will say, no, we should go back to the old ways of doing things. But Tynwald is about change. It is about constant evolution, and we've seen that over the last 1,000 years. We've moved from, a traditional Norse parliament to 17th century governing council to what we have today, which is much more akin to a modern democratic state, and that's really the journey that we're on. And yes, there will always be elements of our tradition that are important to keep, but equally, sometimes you need to change. Tynwald and Parliament needs to reflect the society that it represents. It is no point saying, well, our Parliament is going to be 150 years behind the social conscience of the Isle of Man. That doesn't work. Ultimately, Parliament should be reflective of the society that it is supposed to be serving.
How do you justify then the cost of this, and I mean both in terms of finance and people's time that's involved in putting this all together?
So there is no cost associated with this. I'm running the consultation myself, which is being done at my expense, so there is no public cost to this. The bill itself was drafted for me by the Attorney Generals. It's 3 clauses. I suspect it took them maybe an hour or two at most. I'm very grateful for their support in that, but actually the bill is modelled on the 1971 Amendment Act that removed the Attorney General's vote. It is almost word for word the same. There's a few less whatsoevers in there because the language is updated, but actually as a bill it's almost identical. So really there isn't a lot of cost in this in terms of enacting it. Well, actually when it becomes law, all that happens is the bishop ceases to have a vote. It doesn't change anything in terms of financial terms. So there shouldn't be any cost associated with this other than the cost of me running this consultation. And people will obviously have to give up a little bit of their time to do that. I have tried to keep the consultation very short. It's got, like I say, 4 yes/no questions, plus obviously put your name on it so I know that you're an individual rather than an organisation or whatever. But ultimately, it should take people around about 30 seconds to complete those 4 questions. It really shouldn't be too much time, and I would encourage people to go on the links, which hopefully Manx Radio will share, and provide their responses. If there are any organisations out there listening who are interested, please cascade the consultation to your membership. Ask them to respond in their own right rather than trying to respond on their behalf. Because it's very accessible. There are paper copies available from the clerk's office if anyone should want one, and they can all be returned to the clerk's office, who have again offered their support in terms of collating some of this as part of their normal day-to-day support of members' activities. But I just really want to try and promote this as broadly as possible to try and get as many people to contribute as I can.
And if it goes in your favour, the vote, then you can go back to Tynwald and you've got a bit of weight behind you.
That is something that concerns me, actually, because we know what the Manx Radio poll showed. It's around about 70-30. I know the conversations I've had with people all over the island broadly, I think that is reflective of the views of the people of the Isle of Man. My concern is that I think it will come back in favour of what I'm proposing to do, because I do genuinely believe that's the view of the Manx people. My concern is, though, that people who have opposed this bill, who are the ones that called for the consultation, actually won't accept that result. And I've already had emails in from members questioning the consultation because I shared it with them in advance. One member asking whether I can audit the responses. Obviously, he doesn't trust me to produce a consultation response. It's quite concerning, actually, that after having asked for a consultation, the feeling I'm getting is these members probably aren't going to accept the outcome unless it's in their favour. And I can understand that, actually. It's unlikely to be a consultation filled out by 85,000 people. You know, if I get 1,000 responses, I'll be really happy. Your poll had 363, I think. That was a phenomenal response rate from my perspective. My last consultation on leasehold reform, I think, had 77 responses. So arguably, there is a good argument for saying whatever the result of the consultation, it isn't binding, it's not a referendum, it may not even be statistically significant in terms of our overall population. But I think you're right, it will add a bit of weight to whichever way the consultation goes, does at least add a bit of flavour then to the further conversation around, well, is this the view of the Manx public? Well, at least we've got something to hang our hat on.
Thank you for making it to the end of the Little Manx Radio newscast. You are obviously someone with exquisite taste. May I politely suggest you might want to subscribe to this and a wide range of Manx Radio podcasts at your favourite podcast provider, so our best bits will magically appear on your smartphone. Thank you.